begins to feel safer than speaking honestly. Without realizing it, they surrender the freedom to think independently. Psychological control becomes even stronger when someone slowly convinces you that your own judgment cannot be trusted. They question your memory, they dismiss your instincts, they criticize your decisions until self-doubt replaces confidence. Every mistake becomes proof that you need their guidance. Every success is minimized or explained away. Eventually, you no longer ask yourself what you believe. You immediately seek confirmation from the person influencing you. This is one of the clearest signs that someone else has begun occupying the place where your own judgment should have been. Notice how this process changes the questions people ask themselves. A psychologically free person thinks, does this make sense? A psychologically controlled person thinks, will they approve? That difference may seem small, but it transforms every future decision. The focus shifts from truth to permission. Instead of evaluating reality through personal reasoning, people begin filtering every choice through another person's expectations. The controller no longer needs to watch every action because the controlled individual has learned to monitor themselves. The prison is no longer outside, it exists inside the mind. This is why intelligent people are not immune to psychological control. Intelligence alone does not protect someone from influence. In fact, highly intelligent people sometimes become even more skilled at defending beliefs they never independently examined. Once they emotionally commit to a controlling authority, they begin using their intelligence to justify obedience instead of questioning it. They create logical explanations for decisions that were actually driven by fear of rejection, desire for approval, or dependence on authority. The manipulation becomes stronger because it now feels rational. One of the most effective methods of maintaining psychological control is gradually reducing independent decision-making. At first, someone influences major choices. Then they begin influencing smaller ones. Which career should you choose? Which friends should you trust? How should you spend your time? What should you believe about yourself? Every surrendered decision weakens the habit of independent thinking. The brain becomes comfortable outsourcing judgment. Eventually, making choices without someone else's approval begins to create anxiety because independent thought has become unfamiliar. Perhaps the greatest illusion of psychological control is that it feels voluntary. People believe they are simply following advice, respecting experience, or maintaining harmony. They rarely notice the exact moment when guidance turns into dependence. The transition is so gradual that they mistake obedience for wisdom and compliance for maturity. But there is a crucial difference between learning from others and allowing others to replace your ability to think. Advice expands your perspective. Control replaces it. Guidance encourages independent judgment. Manipulation quietly eliminates it. The psychology of being controlled by others is not built on physical strength. It is built on psychological dependence. The less confidence people have in their own ability to evaluate reality, the more likely they are to surrender that responsibility to someone else. That is why every manipulator seeks the same outcome, not control over your actions first, but control over your thinking. Once your mind begins seeking permission instead of truth, your behavior follows naturally. And once someone learns that they can shape your thoughts, the next stage becomes even more powerful. Because they no longer rely on logic alone, they begin controlling you through your emotions. Once someone begins influencing the way you think, they no longer need to win every argument. Instead, they begin shaping the way you feel. This is where psychological control becomes far more powerful because emotions influence behavior much faster than logic ever can. A person who controls your emotions can often predict your decisions without giving a single direct command. They understand that fear can silence you, guilt can make you obey, shame can weaken your confidence, and hope can keep you attached even when you know you should leave. This is the invisible psychology of emotional manipulation. The strongest controllers rarely force people into submission. They guide emotions until obedience begins to feel like a personal choice. One of the oldest psychological tools of control is guilt. Guilt is powerful because it attacks a person's identity rather than their actions. Instead of saying, "You made a mistake," a manipulator gradually communicates, A good person would never disappoint me. The message is subtle but devastating. It transforms disagreement into selfishness and independence into betrayal. Over time, the controlled person stops asking whether a request is fair. Instead, they ask whether refusing would make them a bad person. Once guilt replaces objective thinking, emotional control has already begun. The manipulator no longer needs to demand obedience because the victim punishes themselves whenever they consider saying no. Fear works differently, but it is equally effective. The human brain is designed to avoid pain before seeking reward. Manipulators understand this instinct remarkably well. They do not always threaten physical consequences. Instead, they create emotional consequences. They imply that disagreement will lead to rejection, criticism, abandonment, humiliation, or isolation. The controlled individual begins connecting independent thinking with emotional danger. Eventually, they remain silent not because they agree, but because speaking honestly feels psychologically unsafe. Fear slowly teaches the brain that obedience is the safest path, even when it comes at the cost of personal freedom. Another powerful method is the silent treatment. Many people mistake silence for emotional distance, but in controlling relationships, it often becomes a psychological weapon. Human beings naturally seek emotional connection. When affection or communication is suddenly withdrawn without explanation, the brain experiences uncertainty. Instead of focusing on whether the treatment is fair, the controlled person becomes desperate to restore the lost connection. They apologize even when they have done nothing wrong. They accept blame simply to end the emotional discomfort. The manipulator discovers something important. Silence can influence behavior more effectively than shouting. The absence of attention becomes a tool for shaping future actions. Excessive praise can also become a method of psychological control. Most people assume manipulation always sounds negative, but controllers often begin with admiration rather than criticism. They make someone feel uniquely appreciated, understood, or important. This emotional reward creates trust and attachment. Then the pattern slowly changes. Praise becomes conditional. Approval is given only when the person behaves exactly as expected. The controlled individual begins working harder to earn the same emotional reward they once received freely. Without realizing it, they have been conditioned to associate obedience with acceptance. Their behavior is no longer guided by personal values, but by the hope of receiving another moment of approval. Shame is another invisible chain. While guilt says, "You did something wrong," shame whispers, "There is something wrong with you." A manipulator repeatedly highlights weaknesses, embarrasses someone publicly, compares them to others, or constantly reminds them of past failures. The goal is not simply to criticize, the goal is to weaken confidence until the person no longer believes they are capable of making good decisions. Once someone feels fundamentally inadequate, they naturally begin relying on the manipulator for guidance, reassurance, and approval. Emotional dependence replaces psychological independence. What makes these tactics so effective is that they rarely appear all at once. They are introduced gradually, often mixed with moments of kindness, affection, or understanding. This inconsistency creates emotional confusion. One day the manipulator is supportive. The next day they become distant or critical. The controlled person begins chasing the return of the earlier warmth. Instead of questioning the unhealthy pattern, they focus entirely on recovering the emotional reward. This cycle strengthens attachment because the brain becomes occupied with unpredictable emotional outcomes rather than objective reality. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of emotional manipulation is that it changes internal decision making. Instead of asking, "Is this right?" the controlled person begins asking, "How will they react?" Every choice becomes emotionally filtered through another person's possible response. Fear of conflict replaces honest communication. Desire for approval replaces independent judgment. Emotional reactions become so predictable that the manipulator no longer needs to issue instructions. They already know which emotions will produce the behavior they want. This is why emotional control is often more powerful than physical control. Physical force can control actions for a moment. Emotional manipulation controls choices long before any action takes place. The person being manipulated believes every decision is voluntary, yet each decision has already been shaped by carefully conditioned emotional responses. They obey because they fear losing affection. They remain silent because they fear criticism. They sacrifice their own needs because guilt convinces them that self-respect is selfish. Their emotions become invisible strings, and someone else quietly learns how to pull them. Understanding this psychology changes the way you see controlling relationships. You begin recognizing that manipulation rarely depends on intelligence, strength, or authority alone. It depends on emotional predictability. The moment someone discovers which emotion controls you most, whether it is guilt, fear, shame, loneliness, or the desperate need for approval, they gain the ability to influence your behavior with remarkable precision. That is why emotional awareness is the first defense against psychological control. You cannot protect your freedom until you recognize which emotions someone else has been taught to use against you. And once emotional manipulation succeeds in controlling your reactions, the next stage becomes even more dangerous because you begin seeking approval from the very person who has been controlling you all along. The moment emotional manipulation becomes familiar, a strange psychological transformation begins to take place. Instead of pulling away from the person who constantly controls them, many people become even more emotionally attached. From the outside, this makes no sense. Why would someone seek approval from the very person who repeatedly makes them feel anxious, guilty, or inadequate? Yet this is one of the most powerful mechanisms behind psychological control. The controller is no longer influencing behavior through fear alone. They have created emotional dependency. The controlled person gradually begins believing that the only way to feel accepted, safe, or valuable is to receive approval from the person who has been withholding it. This is why psychological control often becomes stronger over time instead of weaker. One reason this happens is that the human brain is wired to seek emotional resolution. When someone repeatedly criticizes you, withdraws affection, or questions your worth, your mind naturally wants to repair the relationship. Instead of asking, "Why am I being treated this way?" many people begin asking, "What can I do to make them happy again?" Notice how the focus changes. The problem is no longer the controller's behavior. The problem becomes your own behavior. This shift is exactly what the manipulator wants. Once you believe that changing yourself is the solution, they no longer have to change anything. A powerful psychological force behind this pattern is approval addiction. Every human being enjoys appreciation, but approval becomes dangerous when it starts defining personal worth. Controllers understand this instinct, whether consciously or unconsciously. They rarely give consistent validation. Instead, they provide it unpredictably. One day they praise you, making you feel important. The next day they become distant, critical, or emotionally unavailable. This inconsistency creates a powerful psychological cycle. Because approval is no longer guaranteed, your brain begins treating every small sign of acceptance as a valuable reward. You stop focusing on whether the relationship is healthy and become completely focused on earning the next moment of approval. This process is strengthened by a psychological principle known as intermittent reinforcement. Studies of human behavior consistently show that unpredictable rewards often create stronger attachment than predictable ones. When a reward arrives randomly, the brain keeps expecting the next one. It remains emotionally engaged because certainty never arrives. The same mechanism explains why many people become deeply attached to controlling relationships. They never know when kindness will return. A single compliment after weeks of criticism feels incredibly meaningful. One affectionate conversation after days of silence creates hope that everything has changed. In reality, the inconsistencies itself keeps the attachment alive. Another reason people seek approval from those who control them is because their identity slowly becomes dependent on that relationship. At the beginning, they have their own opinions, interests, and confidence. But after months or years of constant influence, they begin measuring themselves through the controller's reactions. If the controller smiles, they feel successful. If the controller criticizes them, they feel like failures. Their emotional state becomes externally controlled. They are no longer asking, "How do I feel about myself?" Instead, they ask, how does this person feel about me today? That shift marks one of the deepest forms of psychological dependence. Control often strengthen this dependence by isolating people emotionally. They may repeatedly suggest that no one else truly understands them, that friends cannot be trusted, or that outsiders are jealous or dishonest. Gradually, the controlled individual begins relying on one emotional source for comfort, advice, and validation. The fewer independent relationships they maintain, the stronger the controller's influence becomes. This isolation does not always involve physical separation. Often it is psychological. Alternative perspectives slowly disappear until the controller's voice becomes the dominant reality. Over time, another dangerous belief begins forming. The controlled person starts believing that the controller's approval is difficult to earn because it is exceptionally valuable. This is a psychological illusion. Human beings often associate difficulty with importance. If gaining someone's acceptance requires endless effort, sacrifice, and emotional pain, the brain mistakenly assumes that acceptance must be incredibly meaningful. Instead of questioning why approval is constantly withheld, people convince themselves they simply have not tried hard enough. They work even harder to earn something that is intentionally kept just beyond their reach. There is also a deep connection between control and self-worth. Continuous criticism slowly weakens confidence, while occasional praise temporarily restores it. This creates emotional dependence because the same person causing insecurity also becomes the only source of temporary relief. The controller creates the emotional wound and then briefly provides the comfort. The controlled individual mistakes that relief for genuine care, never realizing that the cycle itself is what keeps them emotionally attached. They are not attached because the relationship is healthy. They are attached because their emotional balance has become dependent on the controller's reactions. Psychological control reaches its highest level when people begin defending the very behavior that hurts them. They excuse constant criticism by calling it honesty. They justify manipulation by calling it love. They explain emotional neglect as stress or misunderstanding. Their mind creates logical explanations because accepting the truth would be emotionally painful. Admitting that someone they trust has been controlling them threatens their entire understanding of the relationship. So the brain often chooses denial over reality. This protects them from immediate pain, but strengthens the controller's influence even further. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward breaking it. The moment you realize that your need for someone's approval has become stronger than your trust in your own judgment, you begin seeing the relationship differently. You stop asking how to earn more acceptance and start asking why your self-worth became dependent on someone else's permission in the first place. That single question weakens the emotional chains that psychological control depends on. It shifts your attention away from pleasing the controller and back toward understanding yourself. The truth is that no healthy relationship requires you to constantly prove your value. Genuine respect does not need endless tests, unpredictable rewards, or emotional confusion to survive. When your identity no longer depends on another person's approval, psychological control begins losing its greatest source of power. And once the need for approval starts fading, controllers often respond in the same predictable way. They begin attacking the one thing that could set you free: your confidence in yourself. The moment a controlling person realizes that you no longer depend entirely on their approval, they rarely try to regain control through open force. Instead, they target something much more important: your confidence. They understand a psychological truth that many people never recognize. A person who trusts their own judgment is incredibly difficult to manipulate. Someone who believes in their own perception questions unfair treatment, notices contradictions, and sets boundaries without constant guilt. But a person who doubts themselves becomes emotionally dependent on outside guidance. That is why psychological control almost always begins with weakening confidence before attempting to control behavior. If they can make you distrust your own mind, they no longer need to control every decision. You will begin controlling yourself on their behalf. One of the most common methods used to destroy confidence is constant criticism. Notice that healthy feedback focuses on helping someone improve. Psychological control uses criticism differently. The goal is not growth, the goal is dependence. A controller repeatedly highlights flaws, points out mistakes, questions decisions, and minimizes achievements until the person begins believing they are never quite good enough. At first, the criticism may seem reasonable. Everyone makes mistakes. But over time, the pattern becomes obvious. Success is ignored while failures are remembered. Strengths are dismissed while weaknesses are repeated again and again. The purpose is simple. If you never feel capable, you will continue relying on the person who claims to know better. Another powerful tactic is comparison. Instead of evaluating you as an individual, the controller constantly measures you against someone else. They say things like, "Why can't you be more like them?" Or "Everyone else understands except you." This strategy attacks identity rather than performance. It creates the illusion that you are permanently falling behind. The human brain naturally fears social inadequacy because belonging has always been linked to survival. When someone repeatedly compares you to others, they activate that fear. Instead of asking whether the comparison is fair, you become focused on proving that you are finally worthy. Once again, your energy shifts away from independent thinking and toward earning approval. Perhaps the most dangerous weapon in psychological control is gaslighting. Unlike ordinary disagreement, gaslighting is designed to make you question your own perception of reality. A controller may deny things they clearly said, insist events happen differently, or accuse you of imagining situations that actually occurred. If this happens once, it may simply be a misunderstanding, but when it happens repeatedly, the psychological effect becomes profound. You stop trusting your memory. You begin replaying conversations in your mind, wondering whether you misunderstood. Eventually, you rely on the controller's version of reality because your own perception no longer feels reliable. At that moment, control has moved beyond behavior and entered your mind itself. This gradual erosion of confidence also changes the way people make decisions. Instead of acting on their own judgment, they begin seeking constant reassurance. Simple choices suddenly feel overwhelming because they no longer trust themselves to make the right decision. The controller becomes the final authority on everything from personal opinions to life-changing choices. What began as occasional advice slowly transforms into complete psychological dependence. The tragedy is that the controlled person often mistakes this dependence for respect. They believe they are simply valuing another person's wisdom, while in reality they have lost confidence in their own ability to think independently. Another subtle method of breaking confidence is moving the standard of approval. No matter how much effort you make, it is never enough. If you improve in one area, the controller immediately finds another weakness. If you solve one problem, they create a new expectation. This creates a psychological condition where satisfaction is always out of reach. The controlled individual works harder and harder, believing that one final achievement will finally earn lasting approval. But that moment never comes because the goal was never improvement. The goal was to keep you chasing validation. As long as you believe you are one step away from being good enough, you remain emotionally invested in the controller's opinion. There is also a deeper psychological consequence of repeated confidence attacks. Over time, people begin developing learned helplessness. After experiencing constant criticism, repeated failure in earning approval, or endless emotional correction, they stop believing their actions can change anything. They become passive even when opportunities for freedom appear. Instead of asking, "What can I do?" they begin believing, "Nothing I do will ever be enough." This mindset is incredibly valuable to a manipulator because a person who no longer believes in their own ability to influence their future is far less likely to resist control. Controllers often reinforce this helplessness by occasionally acting supportive after periods of harsh criticism. This emotional contrast creates confusion. The controlled person begins believing the controller truly cares because moments of kindness still exist. They ignore the larger pattern and focus on isolated moments of warmth. The occasional encouragement feels meaningful precisely because confidence has already been weakened. The controller becomes both the source of emotional pain and the provider of temporary emotional relief. This cycle deepens dependence because confidence is now restored only through the very person who keeps destroying it. The psychology behind all of these tactics is remarkably consistent. A confident mind evaluates information independently. A doubtful mind seeks permission. The more uncertainty someone feels about their own judgment, the easier it becomes for another person to define reality, assign value, and influence decisions. That is why psychological control is never satisfied with changing your actions alone. It aims to change how you see yourself. Once your inner voice becomes weaker than the controller's voice, resistance begins fading without a single direct command. The greatest defense against this process is recognizing that confidence is not simply a personality trait, it is psychological independence. The moment you begin trusting your own observations, questioning repeated manipulation, and refusing to measure your worth through another person's standards, the foundation of psychological control starts to crack. A manipulator can only dominate a mind that no longer believes in itself. The instant self-trust returns, control becomes much harder to maintain. And when your confidence begins returning, the controller loses their most powerful weapon, leaving them with only one option: to provoke emotional reactions in a final attempt to keep their influence alive. When confidence begins returning, something unexpected happens inside every controlling relationship. The manipulator senses that their influence is weakening. They notice that you question their words instead of accepting them automatically. You no longer seek permission before every decision. Their criticism no longer shakes your identity the way it once did. At this point, many people expect the controller to become calmer, but the opposite often happens. They increase emotional pressure because emotional reactions are the final thread holding their control together. This is why one of the greatest psychological weapons against manipulation is not louder arguments or stronger emotion. It is emotional discipline. The moment you stop reacting the way they expect, the entire structure of psychological control begins to collapse. Every manipulator studies emotional patterns, whether consciously or unconsciously. They learn what frightens you, what makes you feel guilty, what provokes anger, and what causes you to defend yourself. Once they understand these emotional triggers, they no longer need to control every situation directly. They simply activate the right emotion, knowing that your reaction will produce the outcome they want. If guilt makes you apologize, they create guilt. If anger causes you to lose credibility, they provoke anger. If fear keeps you obedient, they remind you of the consequences of disagreement. The manipulation succeeds because your emotional responses become predictable. They are no longer responding to reality. They are responding to psychological conditioning. This is why emotional reactions are so valuable to a controlling person. Every time you immediately defend yourself against false accusations, they know exactly how to keep the conversation focused on your emotions instead of their behavior. Every time you become desperate to explain yourself after being unfairly criticized, they discover that confusion is enough to control your attention. Every time you argue endlessly to prove your innocence, you unknowingly accept the role they assign to you. The discussion is no longer about truth. It becomes about keeping you emotionally occupied while they quietly maintain psychological dominance. One of the most effective techniques controllers use is deliberate provocation. They make small disrespectful comments, twist your words, ignore your boundaries, or accuse you of intentions you never had. The goal is rarely the accusation itself. The goal is your reaction. If you become angry, they call you unstable. If you become emotional, they describe you as irrational. If you defend yourself repeatedly, they portray you as insecure. In every outcome, your reaction becomes the evidence they use to justify their original behavior. The trap was never about the argument. It was about creating an emotional response that could be used against you. Another powerful method is forcing unnecessary explanations. Healthy relationships welcome honest communication, but manipulation turns explanation into a psychological burden. Controllers repeatedly demand reasons for harmless decisions, innocent conversations, personal boundaries, or independent opinions. They question every choice until you begin feeling responsible for justifying your entire existence. Without noticing it, You start believing that every decision requires someone else's approval. The more you explain, the more opportunities they gain to criticize, question, or reinterpret your words. This endless cycle keeps you emotionally exhausted while reinforcing their authority over your decisions. The psychological breakthrough comes when you understand that not every accusation deserves a defense, not every insult deserves a response, and not every misunderstanding requires endless explanation. Emotional discipline is not silence because you are weak. It is silence because you recognize when someone is trying to control the conversation instead of seeking the truth. A calm response interrupts the manipulator's expectations. They prepared themselves for anger, fear, or desperation. Instead, they encounter emotional stability. Suddenly, the psychological pattern they relied upon no longer works. This does not mean suppressing every emotion or pretending nothing affects you. Emotional discipline is different from emotional repression. Repression hides emotions while allowing them to grow internally. Discipline acknowledges emotions without allowing them to dictate behavior. You may still feel hurt, disappointed, or frustrated, but you no longer allow those feelings to decide your next action. This distinction is critical because psychological control depends on impulsive reactions. The moment your response becomes intentional rather than automatic, manipulation loses much of its influence. Boundaries also become a powerful form of emotional discipline. A boundary is not an attempt to control another person. It is a clear decision about what behavior you will or will not accept. Manipulators often react strongly when boundaries appear because boundaries reduce access to emotional control. Someone who previously relied on guilt may accuse you of becoming selfish. Someone who depended on fear may become more aggressive. Someone who controlled you through constant criticism may suddenly become unusually kind. These reactions reveal an important psychological truth. When control begins disappearing, manipulation often becomes more obvious because the old methods no longer produce the desired results. Another significant shift occurs inside your own mind. Instead of asking, "How do I make them understand me?" you begin asking, "Why am I trying so hard to convince someone who benefits from misunderstanding me?" This single question transforms your perspective. It redirects attention away from winning emotional battles and toward recognizing unhealthy psychological patterns. You stop measuring success by changing the manipulator's opinion and start measuring it by protecting your own emotional stability. The more emotionally disciplined you become, the more difficult it becomes for someone else to predict your behavior. They can no longer rely on guilt to make you surrender, fear to silence you, or anger to discredit you. Their usual psychological tools stop producing the expected outcomes. For perhaps the first time, they are forced to face someone who responds thoughtfully instead of reactively. This is why emotional discipline is one of the strongest forms of psychological resistance. It removes the invisible strings that manipulators have been pulling for so long. In the end, psychological control survives only while your emotions remain easier to influence than your principles. The moment your values become stronger than your impulses, the controller begins losing access to the one thing they depended on most, your predictable reactions. Calmness becomes your protection, boundaries become your strength, and self-control becomes the quiet force that no manipulation can easily overcome. And once emotional reactions no longer control your decisions, the final stage of psychological freedom begins. Living a life where your identity no longer depends on anyone else's permission, approval, or control. Everything we have explored leads to one final psychological truth. The highest form of control is not making someone obey your commands. It is making them believe they need your permission to become themselves. This is the invisible destination of psychological manipulation. It begins by influencing your thoughts, strengthens through your emotions, grows through your dependence on approval, and survives by weakening your confidence. Eventually, the controlled person no longer asks, "What kind of life do I want?" Instead, they ask, "Will they accept the life I choose?" At that moment, control has reached its deepest level because your identity has become dependent on someone else's judgment. The only way to completely break this cycle is to reclaim something no manipulator can permanently own unless you surrender it: your psychological independence. Many people believe freedom simply means escaping a controlling relationship, leaving a toxic workplace, or distancing themselves from manipulative individuals. While those steps may be necessary, they are not enough by themselves. Physical distance does not automatically create psychological freedom. A person may leave the controller, yet continue living according to the controller's voice for years. They still hear the criticism before making decisions. They still fear rejection when expressing opinion. They still feel guilty for setting healthy boundaries. This happens because manipulation changes internal habits before it changes external behavior. The real prison was never only the relationship. It was the belief that your worth depended on someone else's approval. One of the clearest signs that psychological freedom has returned is when your decisions begin reflecting your values instead of your fears. Earlier, fear of criticism shaped your choices. Fear of disappointing others influenced your behavior. Fear of rejection silenced your opinions. But as psychological independence grows, something remarkable changes. You no longer ask, "What decision will make everyone happy?" Instead, you ask, "What decision is consistent with my principles?" This shift is not selfishness. It is the restorations of personal responsibility. A psychologically free person accepts that not everyone will approve of their choices, yet they refuse to betray themselves simply to earn temporary acceptance. Another important transformation involves your relationship with approval itself. Approval is pleasant, but it is no longer necessary for your emotional stability. Praise becomes something you appreciate rather than something you depend on. Criticism becomes information to evaluate rather than a verdict on your identity. This is one of the strongest defenses against future manipulation because controllers rely on emotional dependence. If your confidence rises and falls entirely according to another person's opinion, influence becomes easy. But when your self-worth is grounded in your own character, honesty, and consistent values, emotional manipulation loses much of its power. But psychological independence also changes how you see relationships. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this person from leaving?" you begin asking, "Does this relationship allow both people to grow with mutual respect?" That question completely transforms the balance of power. Control thrives where one person constantly seeks permission while the other constantly grants or withholds it. Healthy relationships work differently. Respect flows in both directions. Opinions can be expressed without fear. Boundaries are acknowledged rather than punished. Disagreement does not threaten someone's identity because both people recognize each other's independence. There is another psychological lesson that many people overlook. Freedom does not require becoming emotionally cold, distrustful, or completely self-sufficient. Some people escape manipulation only to build emotional walls around themselves, believing vulnerability itself is dangerous. But true psychological independence is not isolation. It is the ability to care deeply without surrendering your identity. You can love someone without allowing them to define your worth. You can respect another person's advice without abandoning your own judgment. You can remain open, compassionate, and emotionally available while still protecting your ability to think independently. That balance is where genuine strength exists. Notice how every stage of psychological control gradually disappears once self-awareness increases. Authority loses influence when you question instead of blindly accepting. Emotional manipulation weakens when you recognize your triggers. Approval addiction fades when your confidence no longer depends on external validation. Gaslighting loses its power when you trust your own observations. Provocation becomes ineffective when your reactions are guided by principles instead of impulses. Every chain that once held your mind together begins breaking because the foundation of control, psychological dependence, no longer exists. Perhaps the most liberating realization is that no one can permanently control a person who consistently examines their own thinking. Self-awareness acts like a psychological mirror. Before accepting guilt, you ask whether it is justified. Before obeying fear, you ask whether the threat is real. Before seeking approval, you ask whether you are sacrificing your values. These questions interrupt automatic conditioning. They return decision-making to the place where it always belonged, your own mind. Manipulation depends on unconscious reactions. Freedom begins with conscious reflection. History repeatedly shows that the strongest individuals were not those who controlled the greatest number of people. They were those who refused to surrender control of themselves. Their opinions could not be purchased with praise. Their values could not be changed through intimidation. Their identity did not disappear because someone criticized them. They listened carefully, learned constantly, and remained open to wisdom, but they never replaced their own judgment with blind obedience. Their greatest strength was not dominance over others, it was mastery over their own mind. The psychology of being controlled by others is ultimately the psychology of forgotten self-trust. Manipulators succeed when people stop believing in their own ability to evaluate reality, make decisions, and determine their own worth. The moment that trust returns, the entire structure of psychological control begins collapsing. You no longer need permission to speak, to disagree, to grow, or to become the person your values call you to become. You stop measuring your life through another person's approval and start measuring it through integrity, awareness, and personal responsibility. In the end, the greatest freedom is not found in controlling other people. It is found in becoming someone whose mind, emotions, values, and identity can no longer be quietly controlled by anyone else.